Hello and welcome to Choose a Fi. Today on the show, we have my good friend Cory Muscara, who's back. He was last on the show over 5 years ago, and he's here to talk about mindfulness, meditation, and positive psychology. And I think there was no one better to talk about this on Choose a Fi because Cory is a member of the Fi community and has been for an extended period of time. But it certainly doesn't stop there. He's a former monk. He's the host of the Practicing Human podcast, and he's the author of Stop Missing Your Life: How to Be Deeply Present in an Unpresent World. He's taught mindful leadership at Columbia University and is an instructor of positive psychology at the University of Pennsylvania. Cory's meditations have been heard more than 25 million times in over 150 countries, and his goal is to share wisdom in a practical and accessible way. You're going to really enjoy this conversation. With that, welcome to Choose FI. All right, before we get in the show, I wanted to read a podcast review, and this one came in from Matthew. He said, "Be a sponge. I'm new to the concepts of FI and really just started listening a few years ago. This podcast is always on my list of downloads, and I love the constant stream of action items Brad offers. My only recommendation to you is to be a sponge and soak up all the information this podcast provides. The fire is spreading." And Matthew, thank you for sending this in. And I would really appreciate if you, the listener, could give us a 5-star podcast review. It really makes a difference. So go to chooseavi.com/review, and that'll give you the exact simple step-by-step directions to give us a review on either Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And then shoot me an email at feedback@chooseavi.com and send me a screenshot. And each week, I'm going to read one of these. So thanks again. And Cory, with that, my friend, it's so good to see you. It has been way too long.
It's great to be back, Brad. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's hard to believe it has been 5.5 years since you've been on the show. And we were just talking, we're both from Long Island.
Yep.
And it's been probably 5 years since we've seen each other in person. So it's this is wild.
Since then, I moved from one expensive place to a more expensive place, Long Island to Palo Alto.
Yeah, I think Palo Alto makes Long Island look like a low cost of living.
I know. You were really selling me on Richmond last time we talked. And well, a woman had a different plan for me.
Yeah. Well, and again, congratulations. There's some big news that just went on in your life. So
Yes.
Huge congrats on the engagement.
Thank you. Thank you.
And well, while we're talking about Palo Alto, let's talk FI before we get into positive psychology and mindfulness. Obviously, that is a massive change in your budget, right? I mean, was that a simple decision? Was it simply, hey, my girlfriend, now fiance, lives in Palo Alto, so this is a not negotiable? Like, how do you navigate such a major decision?
Yeah, good question. It's one we're still having lots of conversations about. You know, there's lots of things I'm always navigating on a mental level in my life and how I make decisions, pro-conning things out on an Excel spreadsheet, financial and otherwise. And then there's also just a deeper thread that I'm following in my life. I call it like the pulse of truth. Other people might call it like the soul's voice. But that's the thing for me that transcends and carries me through all these other little decisions I could make. So if I was just leading my life from the perspective of optimizing for FI, this would be a terrible move. But meeting Brianna, my fiance, when we knew we were going to be together, it felt like that just had its own momentum, and where that's taking us and the decisions it's leading us to make, it's now just being filtered through a different lens. And so when we feel into the flow of our life right now, where it's pulling us, it feels like we're here. She works at Stanford. We love being part of this community. We also love being in the Bay Area and the weather out here. There's tons of perks, and there are big question marks around, I mean, the timeline to retire here versus somewhere else. We both love our work, so that's not a question that is something we're looking to do anytime soon. But there are really big considerations there. And we're doing it as a team and on a, I'd say more like month-to-month basis, continuing to check in of like, does this feel right? And I guess since the last time we talked has also been, I think, a deeper transformation for me in my own life. I think I led my life more through the lens of like pro-conning things out on an Excel spreadsheet, and meeting Brianna and kind of tumbling into our relationship and finding our way together, which was its own wild journey. it really like troubled me into a deeper conversation around like how I make decisions. From what place in myself do I make decisions? If I'm not purely making it from my mind of like, this is good for this reason, that's bad for that reason, but dropping into something deeper. What is that deeper thing? What does it mean to trust that as a force that can guide your life? Because it's much more mysterious and unknown. And I could tell you all the reasons not to live here. And yet, when I drop and I get still and I go, am I in the right place right now? It's a very clear yes. It feels spacious. It feels grounded. It doesn't feel anxious. And that's really what I use to guide my life now. Of course, all the financial stuff has to be filtered through that. If we didn't have any money to live here, that would inform a different decision. But yeah, that's how we're taking it right now. And things are going well business wise. So we have the resources to be here, maybe not to buy one of these $5 to $10 million houses that are all over the place, but we're making it work.
That's incredible. I love how the spreadsheets come out, nevertheless, right? Like there is some part of you that, and that's what's so interesting about you in particular, right? At least in my mind's eye, is you have this very strong financial independence sense, but obviously you are a former monk, right? You are a mindfulness and meditation teacher. And that's what's so cool to see this intersection. And I think, I don't know, obviously you've been extraordinarily busy over the last handful of years. I neglected to say, I think you have 500,000 followers on Instagram. You've built just something extraordinary. So I imagine you've been quite busy. But really, what we've tried to do here at Choose a Vi is change the definition of financial independence. It used to be this miserly fire, right?
Mm.
Where it was just this race to early retirement, whatever the heck that meant, regardless of whether you were happy or not, whether you were content or not. And it was just a number on a spreadsheet. Whereas I think we've taken a step back and say, okay, this is about living your life, right? If we're lucky, we get 9 decades on this planet, and to fritter away 2 of them in this race to a number on a screen, it just seems like the height of folly to me.
Yeah. I think the benefit you can get from that is kind of like the high of having a goal and pursuing it and being ruthless in your pursuit of it, and then maybe accomplishing it. And then there's a feel good rush that comes from that in the same way that you might develop mastery or a sense of accomplishment toward anything. But there can be a ton of bypassing needs and life that's happening. And that was the title of my book, Stop Missing Your Life. There's so much life that can get missed when you're just oriented to that thing that you're squeezing yourself toward. The system gets tight, you burn out, but you also just miss like the subtleties of the richness of being alive. And if you're just organizing life around a number, and I would just describe it as like being up in the mind, like living your life from your mind, then yeah, you disconnect from your body, you lose the ability to experience like richness and the subtleties of joy that are available on whatever journey you actually choose.
Yeah, and in your book, if I recollect properly, you talked about spiritual bypassing, and it was how we avoid pain, right? And
Yeah.
generally, it would be overeating or over consuming anything, or etc. But is it possible that what you just mentioned is another form of spiritual bypassing for a certain someone in the Phi community, where how we avoid pain is we don't think about our lives, we just think about this number, and we hyper focus on that.
Oh yeah. I mean, so anything that can captivate your attention, that there's maybe like a really knee jerk response to wanting to pour attention to, can very easily become a form of spiritual bypassing. Not always. Like there's tons of things that draw us in and it feels like the fullness of us wants to immerse there. But one telltale sign of like when you're avoiding something is when you start focusing on something at the exclusion of everything else. And so Phi, like basically what anything can become, but because this is like a compelling area of life, it's something juicy and sensual like money, and you have a goal, you could really track it. It's very easy and very compelling to avoid other trauma that you might be working through, or pain or discomfort, and just immerse yourself toward this goal at the exclusion of those things. And it gives you the high of being in pursuit of something, or the high of being in flow, or the high of being in deep focus, can be misconstrued as healing or happiness. And it may be one facet of happiness. And like you can genuinely live your life in that way. But if you need to be immersed in something or chasing something in order to feel okay, then that is a perpetual state of running. And again, I have nothing against anyone who wants to live their life that way. But usually that's going to come with consequences. You're not going to be able to be still. And if you can't be still, it's hard to have a vulnerable conversation with your partner. And if you can't have a vulnerable conversation with your partner, you're going to have relationship issues, which will trickle down into issues with kids. Or, if you're not able to be present to yourself because you're scared of what's underneath, or you're just used to distracting yourself from yourself, then you're always living in a state of fear, not necessarily fear of the outside, but fear of the inside. And that keeps your mind constantly searching outwardly. And so you're kind of like this jittery animal looking for what's next, chasing the next dopamine hit. And that to me is like the experience of anxiety. And I used to know a life that had more of that. And I know the fun of it because it is fun to pursue something. But I also know that it had consequences and I would feel exhausted and I'd feel disconnected from myself. And when the high of the thing that I was pursuing would fade, I would feel this emptiness. And I didn't want to feel that. I wanted to know a certain depth of well being that could exist without chasing the next thing. And I mean, that's really what motivated a lot of my journey to begin with.
Yeah, I'm certain there are many, many tens of thousands of people listening to this who are saying, that's me, right? This anxiety, the searching for the dopamine hits, the constantly checking the phone. And yet, so many of us are hoping for that stillness and that presence that you're talking about. Where does someone get started? Because I mean, we all hear the buzzwords, right? Mindfulness, meditation, these are wonderful things. I don't think there's any question, but how does someone who has no background in this, Cory, like what's the first step? What are the first couple of steps?
Yeah. Well, the good news is from like, if you want structure to go into this, there are endless resources for free now all over the internet. And I mean, if you want to just learn how to meditate, type in how to meditate in YouTube. I have a free 21-day meditation course on YouTube if you just type in my name, and that'll walk you through a series of practices over 21 days. And I start with that stuff because it can be useful to have some hand holding as you go through. And there's no need to pay for something initially because there's so much foundational stuff out there. The more annoying response that I would say is I would actually start by getting very in touch with the initial intention for something different. If you're hearing what I'm saying in the short bit that we've conversed so far, that you're a listener and you're going, wow, there's something about that that's resonating. I don't really know what it is. I'm not even sure what he's talking about. Spiritual bypassing, don't quite get it, but there's something about what they just said that like lands for me. That to me is interesting. And that to me is the thing, like those little pulses of aliveness or excitement, or maybe even like fear. Something he said really jolted me into like questioning, am I doing the right thing? And it created some fear. Those are really worth looking at and not immediately jumping into action. If you're like me, you hear these things and like you hear the podcast and you hear the conversation, go, oh, that's what I need. And then quickly go, give me the tools. And you go into that without actually marinating in what is the thing that's informing this action that needs to be taken in the first place. And I would say spend some time like going for a walk or in stillness, like sit down, spend some time alone and really reflect on what about this is landing for you. Do you feel like, are you addicted to busyness? Do you feel like you live your life more in your mind and you're not actually able to be still? Okay, if so, let's just spend some time being honest with ourselves about that and feel like, what is that touch? Where might that be coming from? Is there an intuitive sense of what this is connected to? How long have I been living my life like that? And do I even want to shift? Maybe not yet, right? Because there's good reasons why we do the patterns that we do. And it might not necessarily be the right time for us to make those shifts yet. I know that's not a popular thing to say in the personal growth world because there's a lot of pressure and focus on optimizing at all moments, or even like when you see a particular wound or something that needs attention to like particularly jump on it. But I'm a really big believer that what we might call negative habits or patterns or defensive strategies, these things have their own timeline. And the first step is just bringing awareness to these things, shifting from them being unconscious to having some consciousness around them. And then you might play them out for weeks, months, or continue for years, but you do with awareness so that you're understanding, where is this coming from? Why does it feel more comfortable to be in my mind than it does to be in my body? Why do I get a thrill out of focusing so much on a goal, but it's really difficult for me to be still? And anytime there is an opportunity to be still, I deflect. Like, these are rich, rich questions and inquiries that, if you just spend some time being honest with them, they're going to open some doors into what might need attention in yourself. And from there, again, what can come of that? I don't want to just like leave us all in this, okay, well, there's a lot of stuff that's come up. Where do I go with it? Right.
Right.
And this
Go
is
search
where,
and come back, right?
yeah, exactly. And this is where, like, I try to put out lots of resources on my Instagram and these platforms to support that. Genuinely not a plug. I could plug so many different things, Headspace, all these different apps. But yeah, like, I talk about this stuff on my podcast, Practicing Human, on Instagram, for people who are looking to start their healing journey and, you could say, personal growth journey. But again, a good therapist nearby can, at the very least, help to start to hold space, which is a common phrase, but like be with you in these inquiries as you start to descend into the deeper layers of them. And if you just stay with that intention to wake up and to be clearer rather than running from yourself, that is going to take you very far and will just continue to illuminate more and more and more layers.
Yeah, I love that starting point, Corey, because I think, like you said in there, so many of us are looking to be those hyper optimizers. Just give me the tools and let me get on with it, and I'll be fixed, right? And it doesn't work that way. And I think the word that I heard in there was curiosity, and it reminds me of a just a very short quote you had in your book, which was, curiosity can soften fear the same way love can soften hate.
Yeah.
And that jumped off the page to me. But curiosity can soften fear. And yeah, just be a little introspective. Look for these spots of discomfort. Look for when you're running these like invisible scripts. I think that's what I'm trying, Corey. And believe me, I'm at like step 2 of this of 10,000. So I'm no expert, but I think about, why, when I'm doing work sometimes, do I just reflexively go and check email? Or I'm on my phone and I have the 4 apps that I quickly check. Oh, do I have any emails? Do I have any Twitter DMs? And sometimes I don't even know why I do it. It's like it's happening automatically. Even sometimes I have this conscious war with myself, Corey, of like, I don't really want to be doing this, but my finger is essentially going to the Gmail app or something. Like, I don't want to see what's there, but it's just happening. And it's like, I have to imagine this is all wrapped up somehow in those dopamine triggers that you're talking about. But I suspect there's a lot more there. And it just, okay, I have the curiosity and I need to keep going after this, is how I see it. But I suspect you have a lot of people that come to you with exactly what I just described. Like, what would you tell me and the many people like me out there?
Yeah. Well, the relationship between curiosity and fear continues to be very interesting to me, and the potency of curiosity for so many things, but especially in this context, like cravings and urges. To continue first, just to highlight, right? In my book, I talk about that I believe curiosity is the opposite of fear. A lot of times when we think of the opposite of fear, we might think of bravery and courage or strength. But if you look at what fear is, it's this tendency to withdraw and to kind of shut down and to get small. Where curiosity is the tendency to move toward and to expand and to explore. So on an energetic level, you could say they're opposites. And one of the things I found through my meditation practice, and for those who maybe didn't listen to the first episode, which I wouldn't blame you, it was 6 years ago, where I talked about, I had spent a lot of time in a monastery when I was around 22, 23, doing intensive silent meditation practice. And we just meditate 14 hours a day in silence. And I did that for 6 months straight. And it was a very painful period. I had to work with a lot of physical pain, emotional pain, psychological pain. And so when physical pain or any sort of pain arises in the system, one of the things that it triggers is fear, a desire to move away from that, which causes us to want to shift our posture or to get out of our skin or to self-medicate. And what I'd find is that that physical pain would arise, it would trigger that fear response, and that fear response would then trigger all these thoughts of like, I hate this, I can't do this. Why does anyone meditate? What's wrong with me? I'm not doing it right. Nobody else seems to be struggling as much as I am. And then all of that would trigger the desire for, well, it would trigger more emotions, anger, frustration, more fear, and that would trigger a desire for action. I should leave this monastery. I should take a break from this meditation. I would want to use food, which we didn't get much of, as a way to like cover up the intensity of the pain. And so I really got this x-ray view into how the mind works in relationship to uncomfortable experiences. And the key shift for me was first seeing that there was this trigger, right? There was a pain, and then it would trigger all these thoughts related to fear. But that I could actually move toward the pain. So if the pain would arise and then I would feel fear, what would happen if I instead became curious about the fear? And, that seems like an absurd thing to do because now you're moving closer to this thing that's trying to push you away, that's very uncomfortable. But the thing I found about the curious mind state is that it triggered a sense of safety in the system. As soon as I became curious and was like, oh, what is this? What is this pain like? The fear that was coming from a feeling of, I can't be here, this isn't safe, subsided. And it was like, oh, okay. So he's saying it's okay. Let's move closer and see what this is about. Just by becoming curious, it was like the sense of, I got to get out of here evaporated. And then it was like, oh, yeah, what is pain? Oh, pain has, it's throbbing or it feels like pins and needles. And when I stepped out of this reactive tendency to move away and started looking at what is this thing that I actually don't want to be with, I was counterintuitively able to be with it. And it was less scary and it had less control over me. And so if we take that into our day to day life, I mean, it's the same thing with all of these other things that we're reflexively reacting to in our day to day, whether it's a difficult conversation with a spouse that triggers us to go, I don't want to have this conversation. You figure this out on your own. This isn't my stuff. This is your stuff, right? We could take a moment, feel the pain that arises, the frustration, and instead of using that and letting it trigger us into some action that takes us away, go, oh, what is this connected to? And by leaning into it, becoming curious about this feeling of feeling blocked, we can then connect through that with the other person rather than it becoming something that deflects us away. And so for me, in my relationship, I do have this tendency to want to step away when things get uncomfortable. It's just a pattern I developed when I was a kid, stuff that develops when your kid shows up in your most intimate partnerships as well. And so when that happens for me, I have to become curious about it, lean toward it, and go, what's this pointing to? And usually it's something like, I feel like I'm being asked to do something that I actually don't have the capacity to do. And then I'm going to be perceived as like incompetent. It's like, okay, wow, that's very different than this feeling saying, this is a bad person, this is their stuff, you shouldn't have to deal with this. Because now it allows me to have a conversation through that awareness. But in the context of what you're talking about with like the phone and these dopamine urges to reach out and go on that, I think there's a lot of things that could be happening with that. Sometimes I think it's just purely our whole dopaminergic systems are completely messed up and we're just constantly looking for this next hit. But a lot of times it's in response to feeling bored, feeling uncomfortable, feeling like there's a lot going on in your life and too much to handle, that we go on this as a way to step away from that discomfort. And for that, I would again shift that curiosity toward the thing rather than letting the thing hijack you and push you to something else. Because a curiosity toward it is going to allow you to see what the wisdom of the messenger might be. And if there's some boredom or fear or discomfort arising or feeling overwhelmed and you lean toward it, then you can actually have an honest inquiry with it and go, what is this saying I need? Like, am I completely burnt out? Am I not sleeping enough? Do I not love what I'm doing anymore? Do I need to have a difficult conversation with my partner? Do I need to reorganize some big things in my life? And you can so easily bypass those very significant questions in your life by simply deflecting to the phone or to food or to exercise or to any sort of distraction. And as one of my teachers says, we often paint ourselves into a corner and then meditate to feel comfortable there. And this is how many people use meditation, because we're not taking responsibility for the decisions that we're making in our life that are leading to certain places that we are, feelings that we're feeling, and instead feel like, well, I guess I'm stuck. So now let me meditate so I can be more comfortable in the stuckness that I've created, rather than let me look at why I'm doing the things I'm doing, why I'm in the place I'm in, and are there some really hard conversations that I might need to have that I'm avoiding? And that's actually how we lead to more inner freedom rather than just rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic.
Yeah, I'm always looking for these. I don't know. I call it like the human operating system. Like sometimes I'm thinking back to like the Robert Cialdini's book Influence, and like I think the psychological study was something silly. Like you're asking to like essentially cut in line for I don't think it was like Xerox like copying machine or something. And if you use the word because and then give any reason whatsoever, like even if it was nonsensical, it was like a 70 to 95% compliance rate or something. So
Yeah.
again, totally not germane to what we're talking about here. But when you're talking about this curiosity, like shifting towards the thing, I'm seeing that as another, not a hack in a negative sense, but like, okay, there's something fundamental here in our human wiring, is how I hear you describing that. So shift towards the thing, because I think, like you're saying, so many of us, as you were describing, when you have a fight, my habit is to run away as well. And that's just, I don't know why I get this weird antsy feeling. And it's just like, I have to get away. Like, I just need to be away. I need to think. I need to regroup. I can't explain why. It's not a positive thing. Like, I know it's detrimental to the conversation I'm having, to the person I'm dealing with, but yet that's what I do. Right. So it's interesting. Okay. Lean into that. Like, I've never done any type of introspection on why I do that. Where did that come from? Is
Yeah.
this serving me? Right. Like, so that's fantastic, Corey. I mean, that is going to be so helpful to so many people. Just the curiosity, lean into it, shift towards it. You're also talking about this kind of there's the mind, obviously, but there's a big intersection here with the actual body, right? And I think about a famous book that came out a couple years back, "The Body Keeps the Score,"
Hmm.
and the quote in your book, you were talking about this story of like what sounded like some trauma from childhood, where somebody essentially made fun of the size of your nose,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
And you thought it was gone until one day you were in a sounds like a meditation class, and the teacher said something like, "Okay, let's all focus on our nose," and you bugged out, and it was like it was
Yeah.
crazy. And your teacher said the body stores pain and emotions, even if we think we've moved past them. As we reconnect to the body, it can bring up these old wounds, pains, and insecurities that we never fully addressed. I just thought that it was obviously such a small part of the book, but I just thought it was just such a poignant example of okay, a lot of us are in our minds, but our body has a story to tell as well.
Yeah, big time. I'm glad you brought that up. So that the background of that story very quickly was, well, I'm Italian and Sicilian, so larger noses running in the family. They came online more when I went through puberty around seventh, eighth grade, and like so many things with your body, you're not aware of it until other people point it out to you. And this is where most of us, I think, develop a self consciousness. It's just like through our younger years in relationship to peers. I remember someone calling me Big Bird in seventh grade, and I didn't even know what they were referring to. And then, like, someone pointing to my nose. And I remember like looking in the mirror that night and just hating my nose, having this like little hump on it. And for years after that, I would like obsess about it. And I would like, is there medication I could take? Or even just like, I was like, maybe I'll pretend to get in a car accident so I could get a nose job. And I really don't have anything real against plastic surgery. That's a whole other conversation. But the main thing, like a ton of emotion got connected to this part of my body. And I would just feel it in my body. If I would turn like a profile view and there was like someone I was interested in and she would see me, I would think, oh, she must be looking at my nose. And that passed, I think, toward the end of mainly college. And so like 4 years go by, like hardly even think about this anymore. I'm doing this body scan meditation where you connect to different parts of your body and you just bring awareness to it. I'm going through it. It's pretty boring, not much coming up. And then we hit to the nose, and it's just like this flood of emotion. I felt my heart beating fast again. And I just got really uncomfortable in my body. And it was so telling how much, as you're saying, like how the body does keep the score, how much gets stored in the body, and how much you might think you moved past things because maybe your attention is going elsewhere, but it's actually still there. And this is, again, another reason why we might choose to spend more time in our mind or do things that are more psychological or mental than things that have a degree of embodiment. Like you might be more drawn to numbers, right? It's the phi community very interested in numbers, right? And that can be, all of these things can be embodied pursuits, but they can also be very, very psychological, very mental, and very sterile. And you could go, well, what's the big what? Like, why not? Why can't I just live my life like that? First of all, you can absolutely live your life like that. But as we said before, everything that you're doing is being filtered through what you're feeling in the body. Any conversation you have, any trigger from another person or from what you see on the spreadsheet or in your bank account, it's going to trigger something in your body. And if you're not attuned to that feeling in the body and able to move closer to understand, like, what is this about? Is this fear that's arising a rational fear? Is it irrational? Is it because I have like a really complicated relationship with money that stemmed from when I was a child that makes me feel like if I lose some money in my bank account, I'm going to go broke and I'm not going to have any resources and I'm going to be on the street, right? Like this stuff can run super deep. If you don't let yourself go down to those layers and just react to the fear that arises, maybe you don't even feel it. The fear comes up so fast and it pushes you up into your mind. And now you're just thinking of like, oh, I gotta shift jobs, or I gotta do something else, or I gotta go into, like, if you're like me, like isolated mode, like don't talk to anyone, just like figure out this problem all myself. And now, you're not talking to your partner anymore. You're isolated from the kid. Like all these things that can stem from just a moment of something coming up in the body that you weren't aware of or you were running from that had this huge trickle effect. And I mean, the consequences of that can be massive. I mean, it can cause your life to take a totally different course, especially from one intense experience that you weren't able to lean into. And so, like, there's a reason we don't do that. It's uncomfortable. Being in the body is uncomfortable, especially if you're holding trauma. And that's where, I think the intersection of things like trauma work and therapeutic work and psychology and even spirituality, there's a big intersection there with the FIRE movement, especially if you're interested not just in like having more resources, but you're interested in like what that can afford in terms of the life you might live and the happiness you might feel. I think the Dalai Lama said some quote around, you can have all the money in the world, but if you don't have inner happiness and you're living on the 100th floor of some great building in New York City, you're just going to see a window that you can jump out of, which is a pretty intense thing to say. But the main thing being like, you can have all this external freedom, but still be imprisoned in your mind. And that's not happiness and freedom.
Yeah, it is. It is not happiness or freedom. That's for damn sure. And it's funny what you just said brought up something that I saw. I think I saw it on Twitter recently, and it's more related certainly to the body part, which was it was somebody essentially asking the question: if you were offered $1 billion, but you have to have a severe cold every day for the rest of your life, would you take it? And again, this is so tangential and stupid, but like
Oh, it's great.
it's interesting, right? Like, would you do that? I mean, I think there was a poll and it was something like 90% of people said no,
Yeah, of course.
right? Like, could you imagine having a severe cold every single day, but having $1 billion? It's worthless, essentially.
Unless you have some connection to that money that is tied to a deeper connection to your happiness, like let's say like a foundation, and you see the impact that it's having, and you're like, I'm willing to take on this pain because the meaning I feel by giving this money or even spending it for yourself, like I know is going to be greater. But if it's just this like surface, superficial idea of more money is happiness, then like absolutely not. Because most of the time, what we're associating more money with, it's corresponding to some felt sense of happiness. And health is just one of those things specifically that you realize, well, there's that quote, a healthy person has a million wishes, but an unhealthy person has but one. And this was actually the most significant insight for me that sparked I don't know if I've ever talked about this on a podcast, but that sparked my whole spiritual journey. It was when I was in college. It corresponded. I got into meditation because I was trying to impress a girl. There weren't any real noble reasons. She broke up with me shortly afterwards. And so, like, the pain of that caused me to take it more seriously. But the really big aha moment for me was this thought experiment I gave myself, where I said, okay, in life, you can have, let's say you could have $100,000, like max, and you're going to be X amount happy. Or you can have X minus one happiness, just like a little bit less happiness, but have $10 million. Which one would you choose? And I remember just so clearly, at least at that time, it was like, oh, I would do slightly more happiness for 100,000 versus 10 million. And I'd be like, yeah, but you could have 10 million. Yeah, but what is it about the $10 million that I think it's like, well, it would give me a little bit more happiness. But now you know that it's not giving you that. So,
Right.
right. And so for my 21-year-old mind, that was just a huge revelation. Again, said with the understanding that there might be more context and there's different ways you could use money that might impact happiness in a different way. But if you knew that if it was just money for the sake of money and not related to some movement in the happiness needle, then for me, it was just such a clear no. And that's what inspired this whole journey, which was to figure out, well, if that is the key thing that I'm interested in, what actually is that? And how can I figure out what well being looks like, what fulfillment looks like, what inner peace looks like, and then build my life around that understanding rather than pursuing something else and hoping it leads to that fulfillment. Yeah. And that continues to motivate me to this day. And I still get sidetracked. Like
Yeah.
money and other things are very sexy and seductive, even with a lot of contemplative practice. But this inquiry becomes the pillar of what motivates and organizes my life.
Wow. That's incredible. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. Thanks for reminding me of it.
Yeah. Where do you think your 21-year-old self had the wherewithal to make that decision in the thought experiment? Because I suspect there are a lot of 21-year-olds, especially sadly, this is not like oh kids these days, but thinking about like the fetishizing, buying the Lambos and things like this that you see in a lot of these Andrew Tate style horrible corners of the internet that aren't so small anymore, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, how do you think your 21-year-old self had that wherewithal to make that not the happiness, X minus one or X minus whatever, but the just X essentially?
Yeah. I think a lot of variables that I can't take much credit for. I had supportive parents who always really encouraged us to ask questions and to pursue what would lead to fulfillment, which again comes from not that we were like rich by any stretch, but having means where we weren't in poverty. So that makes some space maybe to ask some of these questions and to raise kids through that lens. Not that it can't be done otherwise. And so them consistently encouraging that, not having this deep fear around not having enough money. Although interestingly, I have siblings and they have a different relationship to money. So
Hmm.
even with the same upbringing, but I think a lot of it happened. There was a confluence of a number of events in college that I think led to this inquiry. I thought I was going to go into finance. I had an internship set up on Wall Street. Then we met with this billionaire hedge fund manager in New York Stock Exchange, and he gave a talk, and it just sucked the life out of me. And I just had a very clear recognition of I don't know what I want to do with my life, but I know I do not want to end up like this. So there was some slow disillusionment with what I thought was going to be my path and what I thought was going to lead to fulfillment. And it just happened to happen at a young age and at a point where I was receptive and getting into meditation, and my mind was just kind of a sponge for something new. Yeah. And I followed the thread. That's the only thing I could really give myself. The circumstances that led to it, who knows why. But there was enough of an interest there to follow, and I took it deep. Oh, then I have a type A personality, and my type A personality said, cool, right? You want to make a bunch of money. Now let's just meditate 15 hours a day for 6 months straight in silence. But yeah, there was always an interest for me of like doing things with intensity and what happens when you do the right things with intensity. And I wanted that new right thing to be this inquiry that I was very clear on was for me the most important thing, which was fulfillment and happiness. So I just brought all my intensity to that.
Yeah, I love that. Followed the thread,
Yeah.
right? I think that's That's a cool way of describing what a lot of us like to do, wish we can do, hope we can do in our better selves, right? Is follow the thread. And I think about inflection points. Yours clearly was meeting that, whatever it was, billionaire or decamillionaire and realizing, oh my God, this guy is either A, miserable or just this whole concept is sucking the life out of me and would make me miserable, right? As opposed to, hey, this is what I thought I wanted. This is what is lauded in popular culture as being successful, right? Quote unquote. I think about my inflection point of going to work for one of the biggest accounting firms in the world and seeing it essentially collapse 9 months later due to the Enron scandal,
Wow.
right? Like, which was just a wild thing. And it made me realize like how impermanent a job can be.
Yeah.
And that was the first kind of lead domino that led me to the financial independence movement because I realized like I need to take control of this.
And what was the thread that came up there for you on the heels of that that you were attuned to?
Yeah, for me it was about not letting my life be controlled by forces outside of me if I possibly could exert some influence over it.
Mm.
Yeah, a lot of these senior managers and partners at again, one of the best, if not the best accounting firm in the world, they thought they had made it, right? They had made partner. They were spending all their money and they were living this incredible lifestyle, but many of them were living paycheck to paycheck, unbeknownst to me, but nevertheless, no matter how much money you make, you can spend it, especially on Long Island, right? Like
Yeah.
you know that it can go real quick. And I realized very quickly I simply cannot fall into that lifestyle trap. I can't. I have to build a life where there's a significant savings rate. And that means I've got to make hard decisions, right? Like after Laura and I got married, we left our family and friends, the only place we'd ever lived essentially, and moved down to Richmond. Not that that was an easy decision. It wasn't at all, but it was the only decision for our future in our eyes. It was obvious because we couldn't live where we both needed to work every second for the rest of our lives, or else the house of cards would fall down. And luckily, I got that realization at 22. It was literally 2 months into my job. It was crazy at 22 years old. So yeah, I think that was the realization. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. I always find it so fascinating, right? Like you could call them I spent a lot of time in spiritual communities, but they would call this like you get a download, right? And so like but let's just say an insight of this needs to be done. The terror of that is you genuinely don't know what it looks like in the future. Like the linear mind that wants to know like what are the implications of this. You can kind of tell a story about it, but you don't know, and it can create a lot of fear for people. And I'm sure there's a lot of people hearing this and maybe at these inflection points in their own life, and it's one thing to listen to people who talk about those inflection points and then like kind of made it through to the other side and are enjoying their life to an extent. It's another thing to like be in it. So I just want to speak to for anyone who's in it right now to know, like, from being in it myself in my own way, and your circumstance may be totally different or harder, whatever it may be, like, I know how terrifying it is, how scary, how unfamiliar, and how isolating it can be. And when I'm talking about following the thread, I perceive it as one of the most courageous things you can do because there are going to be so many voices and so many people and so much in culture that's encouraging you to do the opposite or to do the safe thing or to do the right thing. And you're going to have your familial conditioning. You're going to have maybe conditioning from your partner or friends nearby telling you what to do. It is so hard to not give into that and to follow something that's often more subtle, more quiet, like a whisper in you that's saying, I'm being pulled in a different direction. And when I decided not to go into finance, I mean, I was 3 years into my economics degree that was paying a lot of money each year for. And it would have just been easy to ignore this whisper of like, that guy's just having a bad day and finance is it's gonna be good. It's gonna be good. And this is not to crap on the finance industry. I know tons of people in this space who are super happy. But for whatever reason, that happened. And I could have pushed it aside, but I listened to it and it was uncomfortable to listen to it because it had a ton of implications to not do what I was doing. So what, you're going to like start exploring what happiness is? What does that even look like, dude? Like, you're going to be a therapist? How are you going to do that? You have 1 year left in college. And so, what I recommend with these things is trust the insight and then just ask what is one step it is asking me to take. And for me, that step was having a conversation with my parents. Like they came into the city because I was on a school trip there when we met with that guy at the New York Stock Exchange. And I told them this experience. And it was uncomfortable for me to tell because I didn't know how they were going to respond to it. But they met it and they were like, okay, this is interesting. And it allowed space for that to breathe. And then, simultaneously, the thing with the meditation started to come up where my girlfriend was into it and I did it to impress her. But then it became more sincere inquiry. And I had no idea that I could possibly end up in Burma meditating with a shaved head for 6 months at that point. I mean, I was still throwing keg parties in my fraternity. And a year later, I was ordained as a monk. Like, there's no way to know what these things lead to. And that's the beauty of life itself, like the beauty of the mystery and these whispers that come through that we follow. And they're terrifying to follow because the ego mind doesn't like it. It wants security and predictability. But there's a different level of safety in following it, which is like you are connecting the deepest aspect of you that you can. And if you just do that step by step by step by step, you will be protected on a deep level. Protected in the sense of you won't abandon yourself. You'll have a self trust, you'll have a self respect, and you'll always feel that you are your own best companion. And if you can live a life like that, then the external world is going to organize itself around it. You're not going to get past the pain. The pain is still going to be there. It's going to show up in different ways, but it's going to show up within the container of correctness. The container of correctness being you were connected to yourself when you made the decision to do what you did. So you fully opted in, eyes open, and you know that thoroughly because you checked. You asked yourself, is this right? Is this true? And so you move forward. And then the pain that arises is like, okay, yeah, this is life, but I'm here on my own volition. I didn't get ushered into this. I didn't abandon myself. And now I'm dealing with this pain. I opted in on the deepest level. And that's what I mean by following the thread. And then where that leads is like, it's just not even your business. That's the universe's business. That's God's business. It's however you would characterize it. Your business is to be deeply connected, to listen on the deepest level you can, and just be ruthless with your connection to that and the surrender to that. And that is really the only thing I'm interested in this life right now. And where that takes me, I'm just like, hands up, I'm here for the journey.
Wow, Cory, that was remarkable. And like you said, it would have been easy to ignore the whisper. And that was so beautiful to me. And that resonated deeply with me. And I would challenge everyone to really clue in on this. Find those whispers. You can hear them. It's just we often ignore them, right? And then, like Cory said, what is one step it is asking me to take? That one step. What's the next step? So look for that whisper. Cory, that is where we're going to stop because that is just such a powerful, powerful ending. And really, challenge is not the exact right word, but it's the perfect challenge for people to take. We always look for actionable steps, right? And even though this is all internal, you can look for that whisper. And I think it will really be valuable. I can't thank you enough for coming on. I definitely want to do a round two, which will be a round three ultimately on positive psychology. And you asked what would lead to fulfillment, how to find inner peace, and what actually makes a happy life. We're going to do that, but this is the perfect stopping point. So again, my friend, it was really good to see you. And where can people get in touch?
Yeah, thanks, Brad. Best place to follow along would be Instagram at Cory Muscara. I have a free daily podcast called Practicing Human. And I have a free daily text I send out to people, just little nuggets, which has grown into, I think we have like 50,000 people who get those every day. And so that's totally free. If anyone wants to sign up, you could just text the word choose FI to 631-305-2874 and it'll just put you on. You could unsubscribe at any time and there's no strings attached.
Awesome. And we will put all those links in the show notes for sure. So obviously that people could go back and listen to the number or just check it in the show notes. And you can always find the show notes in your podcast player or on our website. So really simply just go to chooseavi.com/ and then the episode number, and you can find all Cory's links and that phone number right there. So again, Cory, thank you. And to the audience, thank you for being here, and look for that whisper.
Thanks, everyone.